So, in today's episode, I'm going to blow everyone's minds. Time, as we know it, does not exist. Well, before you all get super defensive and be like, well, yesterday isn't today, and tomorrow isn't yesterday, so how can you say that time doesn't exist? It really depends on how you define time. And if we change how we define time, then all of classical physics, everything we know about science and the universe, is wrong. Einstein got it wrong, but I believe this warrants a deeper explanation. So, how do people normally define time? Well, the sun rises in the east every morning and sets in the west every night. And there are these four seasons that cycle once every year. But what are those really? Well, we all know that the Earth spins. It rotates in its orbit around the sun, and that is responsible for the day night cycle we depend on to describe time, the hours, minutes, and seconds we have all come to understand as such. So one day is a full rotation of the Earth upon its axis, and 1 year is a full revolution of the Earth around the Sun. And this is how we define time. It is entirely based on an Earth centric view of the universe, of what we can see and feel ourselves without regard for the rest of the universe. If we grew up on Neptune, a year would be much longer, and a day would be different too. It's all about perspective. We define time based on our own observation and not some underlying principle of the universe. And based on that definition, universal time does not exist. So, what does exist? Well, we know that the universe is made up of a lot of stuff. Matter that flies ceaselessly through the cosmos along its own trajectories. The matter in the universe has its own energy, and that gives rise to its motion. Something propelled all the matter in the universe along its merry way. The point is that stuff moves, and it moves in some direction. So we have a velocity. What is velocity? Well, it is the speed at which something moves in some direction. But what is a direction in space? It's not something we can simply define based on our own position. If there is a true center of the universe, it could be said that stuff moves outward from the center. That would be positive velocity. Ordinarily, in classical physics, we define velocity as distance divided by time. But what if we take time out of the equation? Well, let's rewrite the classical equation of velocity. Time is the distance something travels divided by its velocity. In other words, all the stuff in the universe exists in its own reference of time. What does that mean? Well, Allow me to use an analogy to explain it. I am a gamer, specifically a role playing gamer. So the games have a beginning when you first power up the cartridge or other medium, and an end when the game objective is completed. Not all games have an end and will continue indefinitely based on whatever parameters the game code presents, but let's look specifically at those games with a time factor that controls the outcome. And emulation has given me a very deep and meaningful insight into how the game knows when to do certain things. The game code defines all the objects and their states in the game world. The player inputs a command via a keyboard or controller, and the game outputs the changes based on how the input interacts with the code. It's a very simplistic approach to a very complex system, and I have to give video game coders a lot of credit to make something so utterly mind numbingly complex into something so coherent. But I digress. Let's look at point of time in the game. It is simply a set of values for each data location in the game, of which there could be tens of thousands or really more depending on the complexity of the game. With emulation, we can create a save state, a kind of snapshot of the game code at the point in time when the player created it. It saves all the values of each data location so that if it is recalled, it brings the player directly back to that point in the game. Let's say that we create millions of these save states as we progress through the game. Then, if we want, we can bounce back and forth between different points in the game's storyline. Essentially, it makes the player a time traveler in the game, returning to any specific point in the past right up to the last point visited. And we aren't even playing Chrono Trigger. So then, what is time in the game? It is simply a save state of the game code at a single point in the game's storyline. Well, let's extrapolate that into reality. Time is a save state of the universe's game code defining the point of every object and its state, including its velocity at that point. So, why don't we change our view of time to say that time is a series of snapshots of the universe and all the matter in the universe and its states? Everything in the universe is constantly moving, even if it doesn't appear to be. You, possibly sitting there watching this video on your device, are careening through the universe on this giant space rock we call Earth. Solar systems, even galaxies are moving and spinning. Even something that is completely solid is vibrating back and forth with incredible speed. You don't see it because it happens on scales imperceptible to humans. But it is happening. And we are all moving along with it. Curiously, if all the matter in the universe suddenly stopped moving, becoming frozen in place, the entire universe completely frozen, then so too time would stop. Time is dependent on the motion of matter. So, how does all this relate to time travel then? Well, as is normally depicted in such science fiction stories, time travel is the free motion of an object, possibly a person, either forward or backward in time. According to Einstein, it is possible to go back in time if you could exceed the speed of light, which is itself impossible, both laughably incorrect. Light has absolutely nothing to do with any of it. It is entirely possible to travel faster than light. There is nothing physically preventing an object from doing so. But even if you do travel faster than light, time is still passing. If it takes 2 seconds for light to go from point A to point B, and you do it in 1 second, it is still 1 second later than when you started. So Einstein completely missed the ball on this, and for good reason. We simply did not have the technology to truly understand the concept of time. And by technology, I mean video games. So, can we go backward in time? Well, yes and no. If we go back to our save state example, going backward in time would mean reverting the code of the universe to an earlier state, which means that we would need to physically move all the matter in the universe to the point in which it existed at that moment, along with its state values. Which can be done, of course. It would take a tremendous amount of energy to do that. More energy than anything in the universe is capable of producing. What about wormholes? What about wormholes? They can get you from point A to point B faster, but you are still traveling that distance. Matter is still moving, and so time continues to go forward. Now, let me introduce a time paradox, one that no one ever really considers. I ate a hamburger today. It was delicious. At one point in time, that hamburger was a cow. And before that, it was grass. And before that, it was something else. Now, it is a part of me. What we are is entirely composed of some of the stuff that makes up the universe. That stuff didn't just come into being. It was something else before it became us. The air I breathe becomes a part of who I am, but part of that air existed in everyone else throughout history. In other words, some of the air that I breathe was once breathed by Adolf Hitler. So now I have a little Hitler in me. Hitler is a part of me. It is who I am. And Einstein. And I am part dinosaur. Let's say I traveled back in time 1 month to meet the cow that would become my hamburger. But the hamburger was now a part of me, meaning part of that cow was now part of me. So either that cow is missing a part of itself, or I just created new matter from nothing, which is entirely impossible. There cannot be more or less matter in the universe at any time. As that would completely disrupt the normal course of physics, changing constants and causing general chaos. Of course, you could argue that if I go backward in time, I would revert to an earlier state of myself, a state where I hadn't yet eaten the hamburger. But that is not the popular representation of time travel. The same is true of Hitler or Einstein. If I went back in time to meet either of them, would their constitution still be their own? Or would some part of them be some part of something else? Or even me? It creates a huge problem in physics. Arguably, one could concede that rather than travel backward in time, that we somehow opened a portal to a parallel dimension in which the state of matter was somehow perfectly arranged to a point in the original dimension's past, and that my entry of that dimension caused some matter to be moved to another dimension to have physics continue to operate correctly. But again, this is not the popular convention of time travel. So, besides the few exceptions that I discussed, which did not correspond to popular opinion of time travel, it is simply impossible to travel backward in time due to the fact that the past no longer exists in this dimension. Thanks again for listening to me rant about my conception of the universe and physics and time and how that differs from accepted doctrine. If you liked this content, feel free to give it a like, subscribe if you haven't yet already, and consider donating to my Patreon for more exciting content. See you next to Universal Save States.